So, it is a great pleasure and privilege to be introducing Saikat Majumdar today. I have known Saikat for upwards of 30 years. I was calculating for how long I've actually known him, and it is a very long time that we have known him. Because I think primarily, first, we share the same city, which made it possible for you to meet us after you wrote that first letter on letter paper in handwriting to Amit after reading A Strange and Sublime Address. Or was it the first two novels? Maybe just the first one. Since then, we've met regularly over the years. After that first meeting, he became a regular visitor to our home, to coffee places, at other places in the city, and his curiosity and involvement with everything he comes into contact with meant that after a while he became interested also in who I was and what I do, which led to many conversations, long conversations, sometimes without Amit present on. And this is what the conversations have always been on over the years as we've met intermittently. Books, ideas, people, and streams of thought. I think what has always been very attractive about Saikat and the work he does has been his angularity to the mainstream, if I may put it like that. He might look like he wants to belong in the world, but I don't think as a writer, practitioner, academic, critic, he actually feels very much at home in it, which is, I think, a writerly instinct and an essential writerly instinct, perhaps. So I was somewhat surprised when I went to Wikipedia and was told that his novels primarily deal with themes and subjects like religion, memory, sexuality, history, and education. For me, his novels are primarily sensory, vivid, alive. They're about the language. What comes across to me in their pages is the smells of things, the taste of things, just the texture of the time and the visual detail. These are what are very arresting to me. The other commonality, I think, across your novels and your criticism is the manner in which you put something of yourself into each of them. Saikat has 4 novels. The first was called Silverfish. It was published in 2015.
By Kartika.
By Kartika, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. The second, The Firebird, came out in 2015. The Scent of God, 2019. And The Middle Finger, 2022. All of them explore themes and sensations that belong to you. To your world, whether it is the theatre, the performance space in Circarina in The Firebird, or whether it is the city itself, Calcutta in The Silverfish. Vividly, the image that comes to mind is of these condiments drying in the sun on the terrace of an old house in North Calcutta. And you belong to North Calcutta, of course, and you know those alleyways and those buildings so well. They're so much a part of you. So from there, then, it's not much of a jump to the criticism, which first came out as Prose of the World in 2003, when Saikat was still teaching at Stanford University. The introduction is titled Poetics of the Prosaic, which I think is something, again, that he has been concerned with all his life. So it's there in the writers he addresses over there, as well as in the approach he takes to the material. He edited a collection from Duke University Press called The Critic as Amateur. And he also has a book called College Pathways and Possibilities, which is about liberal arts education and the possibilities of that in India today. What is forthcoming is a novel called The Remains of the Body, and a book of criticism called The Amateur, Self-Making and the Humanities in the Postcolony. And in all of that, saying all of that, and I was going to conclude with that, when I suddenly remembered to make a note to say he is also, of course, Professor of English and Creative Writing at Ashoka University. So a very warm welcome to you, Saikat.
Thank you. I'm glad I was almost forgot the last part because the opening parts were so magnetic that I felt like I should just go on. So thank you so much for that, deeply sensitive and generous introduction. I feel like I should retire already from the talk anyway. Going bust is the theme. So the title of this talk initially was The Lost Tradition of Criticism as Art. And then the more I started thinking about the word bust, I started to fall more and more in love with it, that it's actually really more interesting than lost, because the lost is, okay, there's enough romance about it. We know the lost, the wandering. But as I said yesterday, that this fascinating use of the language of finance and speculation, the stock market, in bust, and kind of thinking of art and literature in those lines, and the element of imagination, like you're betting on things and then things, and we just heard a publisher kind of show the practical side of betting. And I think, as I said, I learned from Tim that there's a card game metaphor, going bust, overplaying your hand. So I really thought it's a fascinating new way, a genuinely new way of describing things we've been trying to call alternative, minor, all of these things, but actually it's a genuinely new take. So with that in mind, the bust tradition of criticism as art. Writing for me often begins with a sensation, an image, a feeling, a memory, that of a smell or sight. Something that I can't make sense of, but which still overpowers me. Like a half-visible someone is taken by me, and I'm taken by them, and we must begin the dance to get closer together. Months, sometimes years of cohabitation follows before that can happen. And that happens only if the love is true, because there are false flirtations too. What sensation? What memory? It could be incense. It could be the incense of prayer in a boys' boarding school, the memory of a loved one playing for love or death on stage. They have unleashed fiction for me. But writing about writing is no different. The memory of boredom of waiting endlessly in traffic jams or evenings without electricity or paperwork in a government office had started a book on boredom and fiction. The image of the inattentive student at the back of the class, immersed in a book of their own, started another. Without a powerful sensation, an image, or a memory to push me, I find little that is worth saying to the world. Something happens to me when I meet criticism that melts abstraction of thought with the physicality of lived experience, or the haunting memory of it. I think with my body, with its shocks and sensations. It's an intense way of being alive. It happens with criticism that is pushed by the same impulse that shapes a poem, a painting, a novel. I quote, "Poetry can be only critiqued by poetry," wrote Friedrich Schlegel. Again, quote, "A judgment of art that is not itself an artwork has no citizenship rights in the realm of art," end quote. No citizenship rights at all? I don't know about that. We do like others. We are not totally incestuous or cannibalistic, to take Tim's word. We love the disenchanted gaze of the social sciences, their rootedness in reason in spite of all the play with emotion. But I also want to make a case for some pure family time, something in the direction of critique of poetry by poetry. Something like it, if not quite that. Critique is important, and not just a suspicion as articulated by Paul Ricoeur and turned into an object of suspicion itself by the recent Rita Felsky. I'm thinking of criticism as a response to literature, much like a novel is a response to life. Sometimes the cracked looking glass of a servant, Joyce's Stephen Dedalus might say. A response that is driven by impulses similar to what drives a poem or a play or a song. Ideas, sensation, memory, emotion. No discrimination between them and no hierarchies. Criticism that might even share structural features with them, or even with other art forms such as those of painting or music, some texture or design, even when they don't actually claim artistic status. Art is primary and criticism as secondary is but an illusion, as nothing is primary at all. Art responds to other art just as often as criticism responds to it. It is not the principle but the manner of that response that distinguishes criticism from art. But there is criticism that breaks that manner too. For me, one such critic is A.K. Ramanujan. Some of his most striking essays lack the linear trajectory of the argument that we expect from criticism. Instead of building the teleology of the conclusion, they offer a collage of ideas, examples, stories, personal anecdotes, poems of his own and of others, sometimes spread out like a fan or a flower rather than harnessed in a line that unfolds part by part towards a single goal. There is no movement towards a conclusion, just a scattering of ideas that follow the rhythm of a poem with a recurring refrain. Sometimes there is an idea stated in its fullness at the very beginning, then fleshed out in rich and occasionally contradictory ways. Take the way he opens his essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?, with the example of the dramatic exercise used by the director Stanislavski. The director would give his actors an ordinary sentence such as, "Bring me a cup of tea," and then have it in a range of ways, expressing a range of emotions from the polite to the aggressive. Bring me a cup of tea, 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 bring me a cup of tea. So it's all about where you put the accent. Everything changes depending on that. Likewise with the question, is there an Indian way of thinking? An emphasis on each of the words, is there an Indian way of thinking? 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 And is there an Indian way of thinking? Each of the words yields a radically different question each time. Is there one indeed? Is it actually Indian? Is it really thinking? Can it be quite called a way? Meaning here emerges from sound and performance. Theatrical enactment is the primary condition that produces meanings, contained within the sign of the language. It reminds me of Sanjay Seth's interesting argument about the inseparability of pronunciation and meaning of words as practiced in the recitation of the Vedas. And I quote, "The meaning of texts is imbricated with their sounds and the forms of their recitation," end quote. There is something essentially poetic about Ramanujan's beginning, the positioning of thought, of the open-endedness of the Indian way, something that also lives outside the Enlightenment tradition of reading and interpretation, and the primacy of meaning over sound. For Ramanujan, poetry and performance paves the way for the semiotic significance of words. Sound and rhythm before meaning. Stories follow quickly. First, the personal anecdotes about his father, the Tamil Brahmin man who embodied contradictions, the astronomer and the astrologer, one who saw no essential contradiction between the two. And then the poem about him, I quote, "Sky man in a manhole, with astronomy for dream, astrology for nightmare." Vinay Dharwadkar is alive to the poetry of these essays when he identifies what he calls the, I quote, "ripple effect," a function of Ramanujan's poetic style as a writer of critical prose. The aesthetics of wit, humor, and polyphony have a condensing power that exceeds the reach of critical analysis. Spacious insights are compressed into aphoristic phrases. Dharwadkar points to Ramanujan's fondness for the oblique and the indirect in the Sanskrit device of the Vakrokti, or crooked speech, which hides the serious under the mask of the playful. But Ramanujan's inspirations are eclectic. It is well known that for him, the ideal critical essay was one proposed by Walter Benjamin, where the scholar critic hides behind, I quote, a phalanx of quotations which, like highwaymen, would ambush the passing reader and rob him of his convictions, end quote. Ramanujan's construction of the essay as an anthology quotations has had ripple effects of its own in Indian literary thought. Amit Chaudhuri described his 2001 edited collection, The Picador Book of Modern Indian Literature, which came with 2 introductory essays and unique biographical sketches preceding selections from each writer, as an essay with very long quotations. There is an artistic sensibility that lays out essays as a collage of stories, poems, and quotations, aphoristic turns of phrases that reveal the linguist and the folklorist. But this doesn't feel like the individual artistry of modern private creation that has defined the Western writer since Romanticism. There is something older, something communal and performative in this artist, something that gleans its truths from myths and lores as much as the written word and scriptures, the textual and earthbound alike, the archived and the shapeless, the institutionalized as well as the grounded. Sometimes there is an eclectic effort in the shapeless collectivity of the archive. At such moments, Ramanujan also avoids the role of the anthropologist. The narrative sensibility is such an organic part of the ethnography that nothing distinguishes the narrator from it. Nothing, perhaps barring his narration in English prose. He is a consummate folklorist, such a great collector of stories that he writes them anew in the very act of telling them. But these are also stories that become new in each telling. His widely discussed essay, one that much irked the Hindu right, 300 Ramayanas, makes its point early through the tale of Rama's lost rings in the custody of the king of spirits in the netherworld. And I quote, "There are as many Ramayanas as there are rings on the platter," end quote. Which is essentially endless. The essay is an anthology of stories and poems, the poems quoted and the stories summarized. Stories of Ahalya, Jain retellings of the epic, linguistic variations, incarnations throughout Southeast Asia, frame stories, folk anecdotes, proverbs and aphorisms. It spreads like a tableau, flowering open and out, without any of the linear unfolding of an argument, stated and done with right at the outset. Ramanujan just creates an anthology, a garland of folk art around it. Here is a phalanx of stories and poems and sayings, a delightfully curated museum of experiences cast in language. Curation as criticism, criticism as a museum, criticism as an art gallery. Is this because Ramanujan is a poet? But he was also many other things, a grammarian, a folklorist, a translator, and a prolific essayist. All of this shaped and informed a critical sensibility. He was also very much an academic and a program builder. The shape and structure of the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Chicago owes much to his presence and intervention, as indeed the larger American tradition of South Asian studies. What then beyond what is idiosyncratically Ramanujan can account for this unique genre of criticism that bears the stamp of a polyphonic artist? Is it because he came from outside the Anglo-American tradition of literary criticism that was well entrenched in the academy by the time Ramanujan arrived in the US? This, I think, is one of the most compelling explanations of the strangeness of Ramanujan's criticism and his polyamorous artistry. Criticism as an art form, as a genre of literature, had long become a bust tradition in the Anglo-American academy from where Ramanujan was working. The strangeness of his criticism is the aura of this bust tradition, a forever vanishing alien aura. But a bust tradition implies a boom. What was booming at the time? Was criticism as art ever a dominant form in this space? That was the name of Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's failed dream about criticism and curation of literature by Indian academics. I quote, "The essays, annotated editions, bibliographies that would become part of the literary landscape themselves," end quote. None of which, Mehrotra mourned, ever happened in this country. But what about the Anglo-American world? Was there ever a boom tradition of criticism as art? John Guillory has recently outlined the space within which criticism as an artistic and literary practice eventually went bust in the 20th century. The question of criticism as an artistic practice overlaps with that of criticism as a popular practice. But the two issues are also distinct from each other. Certain elements of literary style have historically shaped the popular life of criticism. But there have been others, some of them radically experimental and idiosyncratic, that are difficult to incorporate into the space of the popular and the public. That space is also shaped by the political relevance or social urgency of issues discussed, or at least the appearance of urgency, increasingly more today. The artistic identity of criticism may or may not respond to such urgencies. They part company just as easily as they come together. But Guillory implies that the two issues were closely linked to each other in the 19th century Anglo-American world of letters. This was the time when criticism meant a mode of writing in the public, journalistic sphere, rather than the university. University training was not crucial for the journalist, critics, who wrote for popular periodicals. Neither were they professionals in the sense of holding journalism degrees, which of course did not exist at the time, but rather in the sense they wrote for money. Their expertise, if indeed there was such a thing, was a matter of self-authorization. And it was not restricted to the literary. According to Guillory, I quote, "Such was the prestige of their discourse, we might say that all of literature aspired to the condition of criticism. In Arnold's famous phrase, the criticism of life," end quote. In the absence of a definite archive, criticism came to be identified through a sensibility and a worldview, often linked to particular practitioners, be it Arnold, John Ruskin, Walter Pater, or Oscar Wilde, author of that provocative work, The Critic as Artist. This was the time when criticism itself was a genre of literature and continued to be seen as such well into the 20th century. But as Guillory points out, the decline of the great periodicals deprived the supergeneric discourse of its institutional base. And soon, with the emergence of academic literary criticism in the 20th century, criticism came to be distinguished from literature. The poetic sensibility would continue to be central in the criticism of T.S. Eliot and the new critics, but the call to enshrine criticism as a professional discipline in the university would also come from one of them, John Crowe Ransom, and that too in one of the great periodicals that continue to thrive to the present day, the Kenyon Review. And I quote Ransom here, "Criticism must become more scientific or precise and systematic, and this means that it must be developed by the collective and sustained effort of learned persons, which means that its proper seat is in the universities," end quote. Within the dwindling nostalgia for figures such as Susan Sontag, Lionel Trilling, Kenneth Burke, and the members of the New York School, criticism marked the university at its primary location and the literary as its specific archive and venue of expertise. The artistic and the experimental as the discourse of criticism moved to the radical margins of literary studies, notably to the space of feminist criticism, particularly from minoritized, transnational or immigrant traditions, such as the work of bell hooks and Trinh Minh Ha. And if one looks beyond the Anglo-American tradition to figures such as Kamau Braithwaite and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. In the meantime, what happened to the mainstream of academic criticism? What was the boom tradition there? A provocative set of answers was offered in 2017 by Joseph North. Ever since literary criticism became an institution and an university discipline, it had been driven by two distinct impulses, that of scholarship as a program of historical contextual study, and that of criticism as a program of aesthetic education. Since the 1970s and 1980s, and particularly since Frederick Jamieson's influential The Political Unconscious, the scholarly paradigm of historical contextual study has completely edged out the project of criticism as a means of aesthetic education. So one has one over the other. According to North, and I quote, there has been what I will call a scholarly turn, by which scholarly approaches which have tended to treat literary texts chiefly as opportunities for cultural and historical analysis have replaced critical approaches which in their day had tended to treat literary texts as a means of cultivating readers' aesthetic sensibilities. End quote. I disagree with North a little bit here. I don't see cultural historical analysis and the cultivation of aesthetic taste as isolated from each other to the extent he does. And I also have crucial differences with what he claims to be the political retreat and withdrawal of the scholarly tone. But it is difficult to deny the weight of his argument that the most influential movements in literary studies since the 1980s have assumed that the works of literature are chiefly of interest as diagnostic instruments for assessing the state of cultures in which they were written or read. One doesn't have to see historical diagnosis as excluding aesthetic education. But even so, the primacy of the former as the defining critical enterprise since the late 20th century keeps it out of sync with the understanding of criticism as a genre of literature. A scholarly approach is more likely to read criticism and literature through the binary relationship of method and archive. But the perception of criticism as an artistic project or something that cannot be disentangled from the art instinct has little time for such a binary. Criticism as a response to something, whether the formal, historical, aesthetic, or political quality of some phenomenon, remains its identifying mark. But this does not distinguish it from genres such as poetry and fiction, as they too respond to life, art, and everything in between. The remaining difference is merely one of genre, such as between poetry, fiction, and drama, rather than any final or defining difference between the intellectual and the artistic. Elements of both must shape all genres of literature, though the proportion will vary depending on the particular instance of practice. Is the artistic component of criticism a bust tradition in the second and third decade of the 21st century? I want to look beyond the return of critical enchantment by the work of art, of being hooked to it, to use Rita Felsky's term. An awareness of the stylistic component of criticism can run against, or at least at odd angles to the historical contextualist reading of literature, even though a call for style is not necessarily an appeal to the aura of art. I'm engrossed by Michel Shaoli's reading of Roland Barthes' book, Empire of Signs, particularly the passages about Japanese food that he quotes from it. And I quote, Japanese rawness is essentially visual. It denotes a certain colored state of the flesh or vegetable substance, entirely visual. Food thereby says that it is not deep. The edible substance is without a precious heart, without a buried power, without a vital secret. No Japanese dish is endowed with a center. To eat is not to respect a menu, but to select with a light touch of the chopsticks, sometimes one color, sometimes another. End quote. Is this a description, an interpretation? Shaoli wonders. Elements of both are at play here, but not in the way we usually think of these processes. According to him, and I quote, the texture of flesh reveals the mystery of its colors, and end quote, which in turn brings out the very Sontagian recognition that I quote again, truth itself not in some unseen depth. Rather than scout the passage for meaning or seek to classify it, Shaoli wonders if indeed it would not be better to ask how the passage seeks to be heard or read. The conventional structures of criticism, that of the thesis and the argument, are not suited to such a passage. He remarks on its peculiar reflective texture. I quote, the text is a bit like the Japanese meal that it takes as its subject. its depth reveals itself on its surface. End quote. Equally tantalizing is the trace of the personal across it, the signature of a subjective presence. Strikingly devoid of any first person reference or even the particularity of an experience, the passage breathes the personal, the close presence of a living being. It holds the fullness of personality and its extinction at the same time. Omnipresent but invisible, the modernist signature of the artist across their art. Shauli's large conception of style, he calls it, and I quote, a much broader phenomenon related to attitude, tone, mood, voice, and tact, is an important gesture for the recognition of criticism as a literary form. That is not his express intent in this essay, though in his book, Something Speaks to Me Where Criticism Begins, which came out last month, he speaks of a certain vulnerability before a work of art, a kind of stupefied silence. Something speaks to me and I wish to speak about it, but I cannot, I fail. This silence is personal. This is what happens when a text addresses me personally, even though it really doesn't. That often it was composed many years, perhaps centuries before my birth. And yet I'm struck and stupefied because I feel it's calling out to me personally. Here is the breathing presence of the thinking, feeling subject of criticism, and a deliciously faltering one. Style is the name of that presence that breaks the binary of thought and feeling, experience and interpretation. Together, they enable criticism. To bring them together is to make a false claim, as they were never separate in the first place. But literary criticism in the academy has depleted the articulating subject and sought to efface them in the manner of the natural sciences. Newton's feelings and fear, his bodily discomfort during his work on gravitational physics are irrelevant. But literature is not physics. Why deny the anxieties and experiences of the critical subject? The particularity of experience is the soul of criticism no less than it is the soul of art. We hear the idiosyncratic melody of the voice of great critics within just a few words. That melody matters just as much as the arguments that we may isolate from the particular context of their utterance. The melody, or for that matter, the dissonance, matters because experience of the encounter with art is as crucial to criticism as the interpretation we falsely separate from it. Interpretation is not what comes after we have cleaned up the mess of the encounter. True interpretation is what occurs in the encounter. Our epiphanies are shot through with sensitivities to meanings and engagements with objects. Particularity of experience and togetherness of thought, emotion, and sensation. These are the two things that have always defined the artistic for me. Everything else is technical, a distribution of genres by way of meter or syntax, length or performance, verse, prose, play. I'm not sure I agree with Shauli's provocative sentence, and I quote, "No definition will ever help us separate literature from non-literature, sculpture from non-sculpture, dance from non-dance," end quote. Representation and form, even when the form is dissonance, as in jazz, remain key for me as the markers of art. Criticism, too, seeks to represent the experience of an art object, and we have lost much of the plot of its form, as Shauli has shown. I take the step that lies ahead. Criticism, when it lives a full life, is as inseparable from art as interpretation is from experience. The separation can be convenient for us, but that has nothing to do with how things really are. Literary traditions have always been bust. Amit Chaudhuri says in the mission statement for the symposium, is the practice or the imagination of criticism as art a bust tradition? Not in the modern story of its origin, such as the one told by Guillory. Criticism as criticism of life, in Matthew Arnold's formulation, was a genre of literature. Academia has turned literature as an archive to be mined. Criticism or scholarship that has increasingly displaced it has marked itself as distinct from literature. It is at once curiously secondary before the primacy of this archive and supreme in its hermeneutic power, the key to the lock of literature. Academic visibility has entailed the invisibility of the critic scholar, the trace of their subjectivity, the timbre of their voice. Criticism as literature has gone underground, living there as a bust tradition. Its dereliction is rich enough for the project of literary activism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saikat, for that really absorbing presentation that spoke on behalf of the bust tradition of criticism as art, but managed, nevertheless, to bring in academic criticism and writerly criticism onto the same page. You're not obviously dealing in binaries. You don't want to argue that one is black and the other is white. You want to see what you can arrive at with the material at hand. I will start off the discussion with just a couple of thoughts that struck me as you were speaking, in fact. You began with Ramanujan. And Ramanujan, of course, was a Kannada writer above and everything else, above and beyond the critical work, the academic work, the university work, all of that. You also mentioned Mehrotra when he bemoans the fact that we haven't produced any good criticism in the universities. But he's talking, if you remember, about English departments.
Yes.
And that allows me to ask you then what you make of this positioning, the manner in which you positioned Ramanujan outside of the Anglo-American tradition of criticism. How then would you, I'd like you to say a few words because perhaps you didn't have the time in this presentation, about regional literatures, about literatures that we write in the other, that are written in the other Indian languages, and whether in fact those literary fields and that literary culture in Hindi or Urdu or Bengali or Marathi, whether those spaces actually do exist outside in a particular way and therefore allow criticism as literature to continue to function almost as a subculture. But it's so just inviting a few reflections on the literary field of Indian writing in Indian languages. That was one. And the other one, of course, and then you took us to, in the latter part of your essay, into this journey where you began with the 19th century and yes, so to my mind immediately print culture and what that brought to my mind, which you didn't mention specifically, but I'm sure is there at the back of your head, were publications such as the Edinburgh Review, for instance, you know, which then brings me to the review essay. So the review essay is something, again, that you haven't had the time to sort of speak about in this talk, but not in the current incarnation in which the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books exists, or the New Yorker for that matter, but in the manner in which the review essay was practiced at one time, and also so productively, say in Bengali, which is the language I know. The essays of Bankim Chandra on a popular literature for Bengali, 1870-71, you know. These were review essays. They started out as review essays. And in fact, in one of the essays, he's reviewing himself. He brings himself into the review. So just asking you to say a few words on the languages and on the form of the review essay in relation to what you're saying really overall, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Those are great questions. And I think they are actually related. And I think, I mean, when I think of that, your own work comes to my mind. Your work on Pramod Chaudhuri, for instance, the chapter that you concluded to a collection, Critic as Amateur, Critic as Roshik, as a kind of critic, as a kind of person immersed in a certain rasa. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we've said this many times that so many of our sort of vernacular writers, bhasha writers, were teachers of English literature, which is kind of quite interesting. Obviously, and University of Allahabad has a distinguished tradition for that. Harbansh Rai Bachchan, then there's in Kolkata, Jadavpur. There's so many places. I think Buddhadev Boshu also taught, right? He taught Jivananda Das, but they taught English. So it's very interesting that what they were doing and what they were talking about. Yeah, and periodicals definitely. I think again you've shown the emergence of a very Habermasian, almost kind of a public sphere, literary public sphere in 19th century Bengal through the periodicals. So there's been work, Sudipta Kobiraj, people have talked about that. I think it's quite fascinating when I think of universities, I think of two disciplines, history and English, and they seem to present kind of almost opposite pictures. It seems to me history has been this great research discipline, and this might be a bit controversial as I say this, but I'm saying this. It's a very, especially saying it at the ISC, great research discipline generating a lot of great research which is recognized globally, and a complete pedagogic failure. I'm sure there are honorable exceptions, great teachers, but generally history doesn't draw that many students to the classroom. And it seems like English has been kind of the opposite. It has been a great pedagogic discipline, going back from Derozio and down to inspiring teachers. I can think of so many in Calcutta alone. But I think research in the sense, but then again, the question becomes, what do you define as research? I mean, maybe because of my training, I think of research very much in the American sense, the whole Hopkins, frame, the Humboldtian model of research, which I think is now very shaky right now, whether that even has any future, what is the future of humanities, all of that is, so that question cannot be answered with confidence, the way, say, an economist can say, oh, these are the directions in economics. So it's, the whole enterprise is so shaky. And there is a kind of a return to, okay, popular criticism, there's a whole anxiety, a lot of semi-public venues, those are coming up. But I have a feeling there is a lot of very interesting criticism in the Indian languages. Again, like you, I also read Bangla, and I can think of so many essays. I mean, obviously Rabindranath, as we know, is as well known for his essays as for his poems and songs and anything. Bankim Chandra, Sharat Chandra, all of them wrote so many essays. I don't think contemporary Bangla writers quite write as much. There's again that. But I'm sure in any other tradition, I'm not really an expert on the different linguistic traditions of India, that has completely happened. But I think I think for some reason we envision the university teacher of literature as a teacher. We tend to think of them as pedagogues. The idea of, and I think that's not a bad thing, but so the kind of writing life of the teachers is not quite visible in the way, I guess, it's in the Anglo-American Academy. So, I don't know, that's a rambling kind of an answer.
No, that's fine. I was actually gesturing more towards the closing down of space for the review essay. That in the Anglo-American sphere, the review essay as it used to exist no longer has a except for a few journals like N+1,
right.
which
right.
Can't compare with the boom of the bust edition of N+1 against the boom of the NYRB.
Right.
But the idiosyncratic review essay seems to have been.
I mean, New Yorker will publish review essays. I mean, Morv Emery's review essay
very particular
of Guillory's
form
book,
and tone.
actually. Yeah.
But very policed.
New Yorker the style is very policed. Even the sentences, the words. It's a kind of very formulaic
which
thing.
Which militates against criticism as art, I think.
Right. Of course. Absolutely. Definitely.
Anyway.
The house style. Yeah.
Yes.
So my question is, in Terry Eagleton's book, he mentions that literary criticism as an art is dying, right? And in that sense, taking that forward and your presentation on that, in many of the universities, say for example Ashoka, that act of literary criticism has been replaced with kind of more argumentative, that you have to prove something by your reading of a text or a certain theoretical underpinning that you see in the text, right? And in that sense, the kind of essays that Virginia Woolf, for example, wrote, or let's say A.K. Ramanujan wrote, that kind of, or that style of essay is not seen anymore. It's more oh, you'll have to perhaps read, do a colonial sort of imagination against imagination reading of Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's kind of like that. That becomes the case, right? And in that sense, would you perhaps say that this kind of writing would itself be out, like this decline in that sort of writing would be like in the context of a certain anxiety or also sort of an attempt to present English studies, literary studies, as this sort of as something sort of catering to like mass needs, or presenting itself as this sort of a humanistic social sciences kind of a thing? Because again, we could sort of then create a distinction between a social science, let's say history paper, or a sociology paper, as sort of giving arguments. This were the case, and these are the instances out of like my research. But with literature, that can be the case, but it also has its own alternative in the form of literary criticism that we see, let's say, in the writing of Virginia Woolf or E.K. Ramanujan, like that's John Ruskin.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, since you mentioned Ashoka, I have to say that that kind of essays are therefore left to the provenance of the creative writing department, where we definitely encourage, and I think all of us, there are writers who also criticize, who also talk about craft, who also write. We write poems, novels, other things, but we also do that. So I think we definitely also teach that. In my class, introductory class to the creative writing program is now the reading for writers. And we read texts, we write essays, we write creative responses. So other ways to think about texts which are not academic. But the main thrust of your question, that why, I think it's absolutely right. There's a, what I also mentioned in my paper, there's a kind of a science model. I think the basic research structure of, again, I know American University is the best, is modeled on sciences. You know, the kind of, and the whole depletion of the personal, the whole kind of factual. And then if you look at disciplines globally, even the social sciences have become way more quantitative, you know, over the last 30, 40 years. Economics used to be a humanistic discipline probably in the 60s and 70s. Now it's almost inseparable from mathematics. Same with sociology. It has moved away. It studies human behavior. And this has a long lineage with positivism and Durkheim, that how positivism had to be enacted through the social sciences. So it has become very quantitative. It is probably more quantitative in the US than in Europe, but still it's generally quantitative. And I think that model has invariably seeped into literary studies. You know, it is very much there. Certainly for one thing, I think in India, that model became dominant primarily through the institution of JNU, which was established with a social scientific vision, the Nehru's vision. And in India, social sciences have gone hand in hand with the nation building project, also the responsible talking about a nation. And JNU was very much part of that vision. And the School of Languages was kind of an appendage to the social sciences. So, and then cultural studies. So, and I think even generally, if you see, look at, you know, books or anything reviewed, they are reviewed for, oh, what is the importance of the subject? You know, this is about an important subject. You know, and then, and as exactly what we are talking about, even reading like people like Nair Masood and all would not be given any review space, you know, if that was the criteria, that is the subject of importance to nation building. So, but that is again a social scientific strain, which I think has been very strong in India always, partly to do with its status as a post-colonial nation or something else or whatever. And that is what we see. And then, you know, obviously theory makes it very easy, because theory is a very powerful tool. I think it's, if you know a little bit of theory, it's possible to look very clever even in writing or in speech. And that's a temptation that's hard to resist anywhere. I think David Lodge has written very funny novels about it. And so that is definitely there. So yeah, absolutely. That is, disciplines can't keep themselves free from neighboring disciplines, but sometimes the effects are good and sometimes they're not so good. So.
I'm always reminded of the introductory page of Vasudha Dalmia and Stuart Blackburn's edition of Indian literatures, where they actually said that literature now should do the same thing that Geertz did in interpreting the Balinese cockfight. They actually mentioned that particular essay, and they said this is what literary history or literature, is. The turn. This is
and I hope
sociological
we are capacious enough to accommodate many approaches. I mean, there's digital humanities and all that stuff. That's fine, but this should not vanish. This tradition should not vanish. That's all I'm saying.
Professor, thank you so much for your wonderful talk to close up the symposium as well. I had a couple of questions segueing from what Professor Rosinka brought up, one on the vernacular and the other on calling forward Clifford Gates again, right? So I'm just thinking across this sense of wanting to bridge fiction and criticism and a certain kind of theoretical drive or impulse, right? To making that accessible in quote unquote a certain kind of legitimacy or a certain sphere of legitimacy, right? Do you see any purchase then in dialoguing with disciplines such as anthropology again, where you have these methods of writing called fictocriticism, and I think that's by Michael Taussig, if I'm not right, if I'm not wrong. So I'm just very curious, is the direction that the bus tradition seeking criticism as art, is the direction that you see this going, or a certain, shall we say, hopeful impulse of this? Do you think it involves a certain kind of movement across disciplines, kind of not necessarily ransacking them for their methods, but also at the same time opening up to more unease and a lot more open-ended questions as such?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of disciplines neighboring. I mean, anthropology, since you mentioned it, has always been a big inspiration for me. I mean, it was a huge inspiration in the writing of my first book, which was on Prose of the World, which was on boredom and literature, because no discipline, other than anthropology, has done such fascinating work on recording the quotidian, the ordinary, and even written on boredom as anthropology has. So it was definitely there, Taussig, and many of those people, I actually used them. But on the other hand, I don't think I'd have been interested in a topic like boredom if I wasn't a novelist. The choice of the topic was very novelistic. Of course, once you decide what to work on, you can draw on things. I think I would have written on something more responsible like nation or race or the kind of things which matter. But I wanted to write about boredom. As I was saying, as I said, that, I had this vision of getting caught in a traffic jam and that. And interestingly, I mean, the book was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement. The reviewer picked out that passage and said that, only in the end does it give his personal story. And this book is essayistic, which is kind of the kiss of death for academic books. But it's always been. Even this book, Amateur, is about, people who fail exams, people who sit in the last bench, who read their own books. So there has to be some kind of image. But once you get it, how you, like again, in this book, historiography has played a big role. So I think absolutely, social sciences, anthropology is a discipline I absolutely love. I mean, I was recently on a search committee, external member of an anthro search committee, and I love the way anthropologists are amazing storytellers, the way they kind of archive and they sort of live through things. But I think when you read a poem or a novel anthropologically, that is different, I think, from reading it in a kind of looking for something else as we look for, I think social studies are, in the end, I think Dipesh Chakraborty puts it very well when he talks about, in the end, why can't history account for the speech of the Santal, the tribal, because Santal will say, I didn't fight this war, God fought this war, and history can't say that. History can't say God fought a war. History is rational. And that's exactly where Maharshi Devi can write a story saying, we don't know what happened, what's going on, they're playing a trick. Literature is free from the responsibilities of the public sphere, and Chakraborty is saying that, history has to be cited in law courts, it has to have a certain responsibility. We are not responsible, we can be responsible, we don't have to be, we can write a story saying no one knows what's going on in somebody's head, it could be God, it could be devil, but that freedom. So I think it's important to remember. So I think some social scientists they always draw on literature, I've noticed that. But it is possible to read literature in a reductive way so that you kind of go to the goal you want to. And we also use social sciences. I've used anthropology, I've used history, but my impulses have always been kind of more playful and idiosyncratic, which I don't think always jives with the social science method.
Thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking. And I tend to sympathize very much with the idea of not opposing, but marking the shift between this kind of research done as inquisitio, as inquisition, where you have to prove things, that it's the method of the sciences. And obviously to prove everyone else that you're right has nothing to do with the humanities. You can prove everyone else that you're right and having said nothing whatsoever. The humanities is about understanding, not about proving. And to understand is to comprehend something and to share a view about things. Obviously, this is not something new. It has existed for a long time. The positive, this German philology, already introduced in the humanities department this idea of proving and provoked the most hilarious humor in history, like searching urtexts for oral poetry, or reordering Propertius' elegies because they thought they had fallen down and been put in the wrong order, when the jumps of subject of Propertius are completely meaningful. So then you have a very different tradition where you have like people like Auerbach or other people that actually they don't pay attention, as you say, to subject, but pay attention to style. And style is precisely something that escapes statistics, mathematics. I mean, mathematical stylistics is the most horrendous subject, in the sense that normally style is defined by something a little bit, it's like a caricature, is something little that makes a difference. But it's not normally very present or statistically significant. It's something that it might be a little different. Sorry, but this was just a comment. My question goes somewhere else. I'm not going to be brief, sorry. I want to take you somewhere else. Is that you started talking about this idea of Schlegel, of poetry being the only one that can criticize poetry, which points to a very important moment in the history of the arts, which is when the art emancipates from this kind of classical poetics, where the norms of the works of art were outside. So you will complain, and you could judge a work of art by just looking, okay, they have to have unity of time or whatever. And then suddenly what he's saying by that notion of universal progressive poetry is that art from now on is going to contain in itself its own criticism. So it's going to contain the conditions, the formal conditions under which the work of art is going to be understood in itself. So if you're proposing now, which I completely sympathize with the idea, but if you're proposing the criticism of art as art, I mean, or maybe I'm not paraphrasing very well, that doesn't mean, under that parameter, that wouldn't only mean that you're going to do an arty text about a work of art, or a sensible text about a work of art that is not going to be like mathematical, but it will also mean in those terms that art criticism should include in itself the formal conditions under which is understood. And that, my question has to do that, can you identify certain typical behaviors, stylistic behaviors, formal behaviors, that will define the kind of art criticism you are advocating? You started also saying that you always start from an image. And an image can be just an objective presentation of something, but images, in the way that literature normally refers to, are ways of linking, are ways of synthesizing, are ways of putting things together. Like a metaphor would put something together by similarity and difference, or montage by direct juxtaposition, or parallelism by correlation. So I was wondering, when you speak about image, is it only like a certain impression, or is a way of behaving, a way of linking, a way of synthesizing? And would you recognize in the kind of art criticism you're advocating some typical formal behaviors that would, obviously there might be very different ones, but some of them that you would identify and you will feel like part of your own work and your own task as a writer? So, yeah.
It's a great question, but obviously it's a question which the answer is a work in progress, because it's I wish one could arrive at the destination that easily. It's a difficult one. For me, I think it's not just an image but a sensation. I need that physical feeling, that atmospheric sense of something that has always driven me as a novelist, that has always driven me as a writer of criticism too, that sense of, and I think that's the origin story. I mean, obviously, when I started this thought about the amateur, the the essay that really inspired me was one by Pankaj Mishra called the Edmund Wilson in Benares, where he failed to write something, and that failure, that image of that failure recounted in very personal terms. And obviously, I have had a long attachment with all these negative motives: failure, boredom, ignorance, which is why bust is where I feel I naturally belong. This is it's going on for a long time, that kind of, and that is attractive. That is attractive to me. What form it will take is a really difficult question. It's a really difficult question. I don't think I want to lay down. I mean, obviously, I think what I'm saying is roughly what Chaudhuri tries to say. It should somehow carry the personality of the critic. That is there. Now, that being said, everybody has a different personality. Everybody chooses different ways to articulate their personality. So there's no one formula for it. I mean, just to give an example, I actually learned to write like this. I've written 2 novels and 1 critical book, and they never came together for me. They started to come together for me when I started writing op-ed articles for newspapers. And that is where I felt I am intervening in a public issue, but on personal terms. I just wrote something about something political, but again driven by an image. So that personal voice gets me into it. But that's just my way. I think everybody will have to find their own way. Everybody will have to find. But I think the culture of training that tells you to efface the personal completely. And some of that is actually essential, because often people come from high school, they're all about me, and I think that is only going up more and more. So we do need to tell them to look at archive. But I think once we've reached a certain responsible moment, you need to again teach people to bring a voice out. And finding a voice is actually very, very difficult. Finding a voice is not talking about myself. Exactly. It's not autobiographical, it's personal. I can talk about something completely different without, as that Barth passage. There's no mention of I, and yet it's intensely personal. So those things are very difficult. But I mean, for me, it took me a long time to arrive there. So I don't always recommend this in the undergraduate or even the graduate classroom. But there should be some place for it, I think, in our conversations about criticism in the academy, in the public sphere. That space is not there, I think.
I doubt it can be taught in the classroom.
So I just want to quickly say something, make an just add something to what was being talked about in terms of criticism in Indian languages. And then I want to make a couple of observations which maybe you could respond to. It was a lovely talk. I mean, that goes without saying. I really liked it, and I read. I think you'd sent it to me, so I liked it when I first read it as well. The comment was to do with recently. We had an academic called Orko Chattopadhyay speak about Nabarun Bhattacharya, the novelist Nabarun Bhattacharya, for Ashoka University, and a new online series on Indian writers. And he said that we are. I'm editing 2 anthologies, one in Bangla and one in English, on Nabarun Bhattacharya, and the Bangla one is a mix of academic writing and essays. The English one is all academic writing. He was just saying this almost as he made this throwaway remark about the fact that it had been difficult to find essays in English by people who could have written essays about Nabarun Bhattacharya in English. So I pursued that for a second. I said, but in Bangla you found people who chose the essay form. So that tells us something about the difference in these cultures and practices, and the ongoing sort of practices even today, coming from a tradition that probably existed earlier. Critical essay, the critical essay. Okay, now the observations. First, since the word anthropology came up, thank you so much for bringing it up. And yeah, I mean, some philosophy, some of the things which are now called philosophy, of course, were sort of not called philosophy at all in the philosophy departments, as we know. The deconstruction began to thrive in literary departments. So talking about neighboring departments and how they not only enter but are legitimized and given a fresh life. Actually, their life in philosophy, deconstruction's life in philosophy, for a long time was in the philosophy department was illegitimate. It was legitimized in the English departments, according to many. And I've certainly met irate European philosophers who have ranted against Derrida and said that this is not philosophy at all, and Foucault maybe, So this was in the 90s that I'm talking about. Okay. However, I mean the thing I'm sort of want to draw attention to here is something like anthropology, which again served as an escape route, let's say, a long time ago to a writer like Ted Hughes, who switched in Cambridge from studying English because he didn't think it was doing very much for him, to anthropology, given the kind of interests he had as a writer. But by now, by the 80s, by the late 80s, anthropology and related social science disciplines become an elite metropolitan discourse. When we are studying anthropology or any one of the other social science disciplines, from the late 80s onwards, we are also partaking of an elite metropolitan academic conversation. There's no way of eliding it. You are not arriving authoritatively at this anthropological standpoint outside of that discourse. This discourse is also what kind of characterizes the discourse, at least as far as my encounters with it in India are concerned. I would say it's an overdetermined interpretative consciousness. So that if I'm looking through the lens of anthropology as a novelist at a man entering a lift in a building, then I'm dwelling on the fact that there's a Ganesh calendar hanging in the lift, and then my overdetermined consciousness is struck by this Ganesh calendar for various cultural reasons and leading to various cultural readings. So I would say that this particular social science anthropological reading is not only a problem in the departments of anthropology, but the way it has entered a certain kind of sensibility in the Indian novel, where we encounter both this sensibility and an inability to leave the Ganesh calendar alone and just describe it as it is. To go back to Kafka's exactitude, to describe whether it's a Ganesh calendar or whether it's a giant insect, to just take it as it is. Going back to the calm that we mentioned earlier.
Or the arches.
Yeah, to not get agitated by taking part in this other conversation where the overdetermined sort of trained mind of a particular kind, training also being a mark of that particular elite discourse, begins to interpret and is unable to leave the detail alone. It leads for a very different kind of fiction. It leads for a very different kind of aesthetic. That's one thing. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is, since you bring it up again and again, and since Michel Charlot, whose book I'm reading too, brings it up, now the whole business of let's bring the subject back to literary criticism. Let's not pretend that, like the sciences, there is no person over here. I think that I completely agree with you. Maybe that needs a little tweak, because we are obviously not talking about bringing the person back in the sense of, people reading in book clubs to read about themselves in books. We are trying to, we have to tackle this onerous and pervasive problem of identification, reading for identification, which sort of, arises from a particular sort of tyranny of the subject, or a vulgarization of the subject. I dislike that character in the book. I wanted to slap that character. You hear that kind of chatter in book clubs and in comment sections, or maybe in the comment boxes of Amazon as well. There, the subject, there's a vulgarized idea of the subject. I don't think that's what you're talking about.
No.
Yeah. So
I mean,
yeah.
particular. I think the right word is particular. When you feel there's a unique, but you can signify the particular without signaling a subject. That's why I think Charlie's criticism of that bath passage is interesting, that the first person doesn't come in, what I did, what I ate, it's not there. But the description is kind of wandering around following a particular strain of thought. That invisibility, I mean, that Stephen Dedalus, that the artist is present everywhere. That is what I'm talking about. So I think maybe the personal is not always the right word to use, but a particular signature. And very quickly on the question of the sociological, I think this is also extremely easy to transport. Like, I really don't want to talk about this novel. What I want to talk about is global warming, but this book is actually a very convenient vehicle to talk about global warming. So let's choose this book. So I'm not interested in any formal choices, characters, nothing there in the book, but I want to get to the issue. So the book as a vehicle of a social issue, and that has become very common, both in public spaces, journalistic spaces, and in the academy, because people are they're teaching problems. They're not teaching books, they're teaching problems. And that is the easy thing to do. Okay, I'm going to get an article about, something, some socially urgent issues. So that is just a peg on which to hang. So I think that's why it's very easily reproducible. Yeah, there's a boom in that. Yeah.
Last question.
Saikat, that was fascinating. I worry that I've something that is very literal as to be a question. But so you spoke about criticism as art, and by way of Shaoli, who uses the example of baths and his sensuous prose to hint at the possibility of criticism that is art in itself. I'm wondering about art produced with the objective of criticizing. Do you suppose fiction may be written with the objective of being criticism instead of narrative or whatever else it might be? That is my first question. And my second question, again, very literal, is emerges from the Schlegel reference. That do you suppose criticism may be achieved in verse instead of prose? I mean, as a writer of prose, I mean, I have only ever read criticism in prose. Do you think it can be achieved in verse?
Isn't the Pope's and didn't Alexander Pope try that essay on criticism? I think that's a great question, but I think that must have been tried. I mean, there's so much of Wordsworth which is critical. There's so much of, so much of Wordsworth's philosophies sort of articulated in verse. But that's a really interesting question. I mean, what was the first question? Sorry, I forgot. Quickly.
Fiction being written with the
I think that is obviously more obvious with fiction. I think we were talking yesterday also, I think after Andre's talk, the subject of the novel of ideas came up, and there's obviously a distinguished European tradition of the novel of ideas, so there is that. I mean, I often teach texts from J.M. Kudzia's Elizabeth Costello, which is, some people call it a novel. I don't know why people call it a novel. It just seems to me sketches and lectures sort of put in a fictional mode. What I find interesting in those texts is often they'll stage a polemic, often they'll stage an argument, and then the characters will do something that will completely belie that argument. So there's kind of a contradiction. So there's a kind of the thesis kind of comes off fragmented. And I think that is the play, that is the sense of play which is really important, that you cannot just go at a thesis in a kind of a linear way. You seem like you're presenting a point and then you just completely mischievously blow it all apart. I think that sense of play is really interesting. I mean, I think Omkar is here. We've discussed novel in Africa in our class, where that Elizabeth and Ugudu, they're talking about their lectures, and then it turns out in the end there's a total anticlimax, that they have a history between them. I think that is very important, that I'm not going for an argument. I look like I'm going for an argument, but yeah, I'm actually, I have something else up my sleeve. Don't trust me. So that element of slyness and mischief should not kind of ever be gone from. That is interesting. It makes you think about things. It makes you think about things in an argumentative way without necessarily being pushed into the chute of an argument.